Hey guys, it's Ben Beyond Repair. I'm back and with more numbers. We're taking a look at the decline that's been happening to League over the last decade or so. Since last time we only really compared last year to this year, I thought that we'd take a step back and look at the bigger picture, as well as addressing some of the concerns that people brought up. Many of which were fair points about how we were taking a look at these numbers. So what we can see here is somebody very helpfully was able to find us the links to the old op.gg so that we could go to Wayback Machine, find the leaderboards numbers, and take a look and compare. So the real main issue with the comparison that we were doing last time was that when we were comparing May to May, not only did we need to keep in mind, which I said in that video, that we need to pay attention to how long from the start of a reset or the start of a season are we? Because obviously if you're one day after the start of a season, there's going to be like barely any players compared to if you're, 9 months into the season, there's going to be way more accounts that have been placed. The issue is that it also matters how long until the end of the season. So if you're 5 months in compared to 5 months in, but last year there were multiple splits, and so you were a couple of days before the end of the ranked season, everyone's going to go try to place all those accounts. And there's going to be more people who will have come back over the last month before the end of the split to have, played a little bit and see what rank they get before the end of the split. So as a result, 2023 and 2024 are heavy outlier years, especially when we're comparing May to May like we did in the last video. So I have all these numbers here going back to 2016 for you when we're looking at May, if you're curious about maybe a more updated picture of where we're at with player counts. But keep in mind that comparing May of this year is more comparable to May of 2022 and before than May of 2023 and 2024, when in 2023 we were 1 or 2 months away from the middle of the season ranked reset that they did, and in 2024 we were literally just days away from the ranked reset that they did in May. So what we actually should prefer to look at is end of the season numbers. And what we can see here is that just straight up, I'll give you the result at the end here, is that in NA since 2016, we're down minus 35% ranked accounts since 2016. In EU West, they're down 15%, and in Korea, they're down 12%. And we can see that there's a big trend that basically followed throughout all of these regions, which is that actually, when we take a look here at the numbers, in 2016 to 2017, NA lost 9%, Korea lost 4%, EU West was still growing a little bit and ended up gaining 12%. But then the following year, which was 2017 to 2018, NA lost another 2%, EU West lost 16%, and Korea actually ended up gaining 2%. So there's a lot going on here, but I think in general, leading into the COVID boost, I think that we saw in general a pretty much a stabilization or a decline, or a slight decline, you would say, in the player base over this time period. I really wish we had numbers going back before 2016. Unfortunately, the op.gg link actually works back till 2014, but unfortunately it didn't show the number of players on the leaderboard. Then it only showed the top, challenger players. So this is all that we have right now. If there is a way to get the, numbers from before 2016, you guys send those over to me and I will pump out a chart for you guys and take a look at it. But we can basically see that from 2016 to 2018, leading into COVID, NA had a slight decline, maybe kind of stabilizing and slowing down its rate of decline. EU was actually still growing between 2016 and 2017, but then had a pretty significant decline from 2017 to 2018. So they were kind of experiencing this late decline that NA was experiencing. They were just experiencing it a little bit later. And then Korea had also pretty much stabilized with very little positive or negative growth in this time period. And then from 2019 to 2020, we had obviously the COVID boost. So we can see that Korea kind of, and this makes a lot of sense, went into lockdowns first, was closer to the area where this was starting. And so Korea had a lot of their COVID boost happen in 2019 and 2020, whereas the vast majority of the COVID boost was happening in 2020 for NA and EU. So we saw a lot of players return to the game, maybe a lot more time to make other accounts and things like that. So we saw a lot more ranked accounts in 2020 than ever before. But this is kind of obviously artificial growth. This was why Netflix was doing really well. All entertainment media and games and stuff like that were just popping off during this period of time, because there were just so many people who had so much time on their hands due to being out of work and COVID, forcing lockdowns and stuff like that, or people working from home and doing other things. But then we went basically right back to where we were before, which was a period of like little to no growth or decline. And we saw that in NA, we went right back in 2021 to -8%. Followed by -1% from 2021 to 2022. In EU, there was still a little bit of lingering growth actually after COVID, with 1% growth in 2021 and 3% growth in 2022. And then in Korea, there was a little bit of growth as well at 3% in 2021, but then a significant drop off and decline in 2022. Now, it also makes sense, I want to point out, that after you see a bunch of players return to the game or extra accounts start playing the game that normally wouldn't have had the time or been able to do that, obviously you're probably going to see this unnatural increase, met with an unnatural decline. But what I don't want people to get confused about here is that these declines here are just declines because of COVID. Because again, when we compare where we're at here at the end to where we were at in the beginning, we'll see that we're a lot worse off, even comparing pre-COVID to now. So it's not just because of COVID. So if we go back to right before COVID and we're thinking about that as we head into these huge declines over the last 2 or 3 years with League, if we look at the numbers, we were really sitting at, 1.8 million in NA, but then you can see we're looking at like 1.2 million in NA. And then we were at 3.1 million in EU, and now we're sitting at 2.7 million in EU, and we were sitting at 4 million in Korea. Maybe that's not a fair number to compare because, again, they had their big growth here from COVID as well. So let's go back one more year for Korea and say 3.4 million. Now they're sitting at 2.9 million. So you can see that the declines here, this -19% for NA in 2023, -15% for EU, -12% for Korea, then -22% again for NA, -23% for EU, and -23% for Korea, were very significant declines that went beyond just what was happening during COVID. Now, to highlight a couple of these, orange areas here real quick, because I think the data is really good, but there are, some slight technicalities here. So we want to talk about the fact here that when there were preseasons in the game, you'll notice that this season has an end date here that I believe it ended on the 8th, for example, yet we're pulling numbers from a couple of days after the end of the season. That's because these numbers are closest to the end of the season that we have available on Wayback Machine. And because there was preseason and not an immediate reset into the start of a new season, this was a pretty accurate reflection of the number of accounts that there were. The only difference that there would have been between the exact end of the season and these dates a couple of days after is just any accounts that placed within the 1 or 2 days after that. So this is totally fine. A lot of these are like that. There are some, like this number in particular, which is quite a large number, is a little bit inflated because the numbers were taken from the middle of the preseason because we had such a limited amount of data on Wayback Machine for this one data point. So that kind of sucks and overinflates the number a little bit. But again, the trend is really the same regardless. So, maybe if this number was a little bit earlier and more accurate, you might see more of that COVID growth in 2020 for Korea and a little bit less in 2019. But the trend is still pretty clear from these numbers, right? In some regions, League was probably still growing in 2016 into 2017, but it's hard to say because we don't have the numbers before 2016. But League was probably still growing through that period, and then sort of stabilizing or losing a pretty decent chunk of player base here with -9%, -2%, -16%. Korea was pretty stable. Boom, we get a huge boost with COVID, +20, +27, plus, 18% for 2 years in a row for Korea. Then we get hit with this really, maybe, we're just stabilizing a little bit like before. There's some losses here, but it's nothing major. And then we get hit with the last 2 years, which have just been absolutely massive. Important to keep in mind, like I said, that the last 2 years are kind of complicated to compare because of the fact that instead of one ranked season ending at the end of the year, we had 2 resets in 2023 and 3 resets in 2024. And I have the end dates here for those. So for 2023, it's pretty straightforward. All of the dates that I was able to pull are from that last day. So these are pretty good numbers. I think they're pretty fair to compare to to one of these previous seasons. However, 2024 had some complications here, which is why these are marked in orange, because I wasn't actually able to find any numbers, surprisingly, on Wayback Machine. Nobody had archived, in January when the third split ended. So we're actually looking at the numbers here from when the second split ended, from 9/24, from September 24th. And you might say, I even thought this myself, that maybe the third split would be more popular because it's traditionally the end of the season, or something like that, that it's the time when people might start to think, oh, it's getting to the end of the year, maybe the league season is ending soon. And so some of those extra players or accounts that might come back, you might assume that maybe they would do that for the third split of the year and maybe not as much for the second split. So maybe this might be an unfair comparison. Luckily, we do have the numbers from both the second split and the third split in Korea. And actually, the decline is worse because the game is continuing to decline out into 2025, rather than, there being more people interested in the third split for some reason or anything like that. Or at least it's outweighed. If the people are more interested in the third split, it's outweighed by the game continuing to lose players and decline. And since, pretty much all of these trends, for the most part, sometimes they're delayed a little bit or a little bit early. We see things like EU continuing to grow for a little bit after NA in Korea. We see things like Korea having COVID at slightly different times than NA and EU. But for the most part, these trends and numbers follow pretty closely with each other. So I'd imagine that if the third split in Korea was even worse in terms of player declines, then I would expect to see the same thing in NA and EU. Of course, we have the May to May numbers, in which I really don't think that you can compare May to May for 2023 and 2024 because they were so close to their split ends that they're going to give you some pretty negative year-over-year numbers here that we see, for every region comparing 2025 to 2024. But what is worth comparing, I think, is, well, where were we at in May of 2016 in these regions compared to where we're at now? Because those are pretty comparable. And we really see the same story that we're seeing up here with the season to season numbers, which is NA is down pretty significantly at -25%. EU is up 10%, but most of the reason why that's an outlier is because EU is continuing to grow, in 2016 to 2017. And so this huge positive growth that they experienced made all the difference, because if we were comparing a very low number here, 2,300,000, if we were comparing 2,700,000 just 1 year later, since EU grew for another year or so, if we compared that to the number now, we would see a decline in EU as well. Korea has also declined, but I think it's worth noting that May to May, Korea hasn't declined too much, only 2% from May 2016 to May 2025. But I think the more important numbers are the end of the season to end of the season numbers. This might suggest that smurfing is maybe a little bit more prevalent in Korea. And that as you get towards the end of the season, you actually see a lot more accounts come out of the woodwork, whether it's people who have, taken a break from the game but come back a month before the end of the season to play their season for 1 month, or whether it's, people grinding a bunch of Smurf accounts or doing all their placements on all their accounts before the end of the season. So where do we go with all of that data? What's going on? I think that the most important thing to think about and keep in mind here is that this is not a decline limited because of COVID. We're down 35% in NA at the end of the season in 2016 compared to the end of the second split in 2024. We're down 35%. That's really not a good look, right? In EU, we're down 15% from 2016 to the second split of 2024. And in Korea, we're down 12% from, the end of the season in 2016 to the second split in 2024. And this would be even worse actually if we compared it to the third split of 2024. So this is a big problem. It is true that most of the decline is being experienced in NA, like the brunt of the decline. But I think when you're seeing minus 15%, minus 12% in EU and Korea, the thing that I was talking about yesterday in my previous video still really is a big problem for the game and still stands, which is, hey, this is a serious decline that's happening across the board, not just in NA. And this is not just something that's happened from last year. This is something that's been happening, obviously there's been periods of ups and downs, mostly just due to COVID. But I mean, if you look at NA, right, it's negative growth, COVID, negative growth, negative growth, negative growth. I mean, NA's been declining since 2016, with the only exception being COVID. If you take a look at all the other regions, like EU had that one period of growth from 2016 to 2017 where the game was still growing there. Then they had negative growth, just like NA was experiencing even before COVID. Then they had some positive years because of COVID, and boom, into some large declines in the last couple of years. Similar situation with Korea. Korea was experiencing negative growth back in 2017, having kind of peaked. Experienced positive growth in 2019 and 2020 because of COVID, a little bit of tiny lingering growth, and then the last 3 years have been a negative decline for Korea of double digits. So I don't think that this is really anything to do with COVID. I don't think that this is just limited to the last year. I don't think it's just limited to NA, although NA is obviously experiencing a bigger decline in player base than other regions. This is a systematic problem with the game. Now we need to talk about why and some of the reasons that people have given. So people have thought about a bunch of different stuff. So people have said, for example, well, this is just something that's happening from last year. Things are cyclical. Games go up and down. It's not that big of a deal. Here's a longer time frame. Obviously, it's not just from last year. Time from reset till season end. We talked about this. It's important to keep in mind both that you're, 5 months from the start of a ranked reset, but that you're also a certain same period of time when you're comparing numbers away from the end of a ranked season, since people will come back and play or, go and finish their placements on their Smurf accounts. Now, this is where it gets kind of interesting. Banning more players and bot accounts. So I took a close look into this one, and there is a really interesting dev vlog that Riot put out that shows that this is actually more significant than I thought that it was. And so we'll talk about that pretty extensively. My initial reaction was, I remember Riot putting out an article saying that they had banned like 50,000 or 55,000 bot accounts. And so I'm thinking to myself, if they ban 55,000 bot accounts, and we're talking about across all regions, not just accounts that were going to go into ranked, but accounts that were going to be used for all kinds of things, it seems a little bit absurd to claim when we're experiencing look, we're down 700,000 players in NA since 2016. We're down 400,000 in EU. We're down 400,000 in Korea. To claim that 50,000 bot accounts last year is the reason for these multi-year declines that we've been seeing. seemed ridiculous to me. However, when I took a look at the dev blog, it is clear that actually 50,000 was a number that came from kind of their initial success with a gigantic ban wave with Vanguard, but that they're actually banning about an average, and have been banning even before Vanguard, about an average of 10,000 bot accounts per week, which is insane. That means 520,000 accounts are being banned per year. Now, again, that's still across all regions, so we have to keep that in mind. But 520,000 accounts per year is a gigantic number. Now, keep in mind what percentage of those accounts are affecting these ranked account numbers. That's really hard to know and hard to estimate, frankly, on our end. One argument would be that, well, 80% of players in games and stuff are just normal games and ARAMs and stuff like that. Ranked is actually a small fraction of what's going on with League. So maybe only 10 or 20% of the accounts that are being banned, mostly bot accounts being banned, are associated with ranked. Maybe it's, only 20%. And if it's only 20%, then we're talking about 100,000 accounts per year instead of 500,000, in which case that still doesn't explain these significant drop-offs that we've seen from last year, or that we've seen from 9 years ago. So you could make that argument. The other argument you could make is, why even use a bot account? Why use a bot leveled account for a normal game? That doesn't really make any sense, right? Like, I can't think of a reason why, unless you wanted to use a bot to, like, maybe unlock the champions or get blue essence, or I can't really think of a good reason why you would need to use a bot account for normal games, right? So plus, casual players are much less likely to go and buy those botted accounts. So it doesn't really make sense, right? I'm kind of leaning towards maybe you guys are right, and the vast majority of the botted accounts are accounts that are just, obviously the main purpose of botting an account is to just level it up to level 30, sell it to somebody so they can play ranked. So maybe the vast majority of the botted accounts that are getting banned are because of this. So we really need to break this down, because it's quite complicated. When they're talking about banning 520,000 accounts or so per year, there's kind of different categories of accounts that they're banning. They're banning players with malicious behavior who are just straight up being toxic. They're banning botted accounts that are being artificially leveled by bots. And they're banning players who are scripting and cheating in the game. Now, we know that even before Vanguard came into effect, the amount of players who were being, or accounts that were being straight up permanently banned for their negative behavior was pretty low compared to the overall player base. And certainly you weren't going to see, minus 20% for a couple of years in a row because we banned too many players. So that's a small piece of it. Then you're going to have people who are scripting and cheating. And again, that's a pretty small piece of it, relatively speaking, compared to the rest of it. There aren't a lot of people who cheat and script in League. It's very difficult to do, and it's always been difficult to do even before Vanguard. So the vast majority of the accounts that are getting banned, I don't know what percentage, but I would wager 80+% of the accounts that are getting banned are just botted accounts. And most of those botted accounts are probably accounts that are being sold to people who are going to use them to play ranked as a smurf. And so a lot of people who are saying that there's less smurfing, I don't see evidence that there's less smurfing going on, because smurfing is not really getting banned. But what is getting banned is botted accounts, and if people are using botted accounts to smurf, then they're getting banned. So this was a personal bias of mine that I missed, because all of my smurf accounts are hand-leveled accounts that are not getting banned. And so I have 10 accounts, and none of them are getting banned, and there's nothing stopping me from smurfing. So I kind of find this notion that there would be somehow less smurfs this year than last year kind of ridiculous. But actually, I'd say that the vast majority of the 520,000 accounts that are getting banned are probably botted accounts that are either waiting to be sold, or people are buying and using as smurf accounts. So I think in a roundabout way, this less smurfing problem is actually happening, and related to the fact that they're banning all these botted accounts. So again, it's super hard to estimate exactly how many they're banning and what kind of impact that is on the player base. We'd really need internal numbers to know this. So we're getting really beyond the scope of what we can do. But I would say that essentially there is something to this. If you're banning 520,000 accounts per year, let's say that half of them are associated with ranked. So you're looking at let's see, 250,000 plus 10,000, so 260,000. So you're looking at 260,000 accounts that are associated with ranked being banned for botting if half of the accounts being banned are like ranked associated accounts. Maybe higher than that even. Then you have to divide that, of course, between multiple regions, including China, which we're going to talk about here in a second. China has many different servers, not just one server. They have literally like 20, 30 servers or something like that. And maybe there's a Chinese op.gg or something where you can see how many players are on the leaderboards and maybe add up all of those servers. But it's not easy to find publicly available data on China and their servers as far as I know. So what we have to keep in mind is that China makes up such a huge population of the game that of those, let's say 260,000 accounts that are getting banned, how many of them are getting banned from China? Probably a huge amount, maybe even half of them or something like that. Because the player base in China could easily be as big as NA, EU, and Korea combined, on top of the fact that it's not just China, but many other regions that we're not taking a look at right here, like Latin America North, Latin America South, Brazil, Middle Eastern server now, Japan, Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Taiwan. We're not even looking at EU, Nordic East, Russia, OSH, right? There's all kinds of servers going on now that we're not looking at in this. So what percentage of those banned accounts that are associated with ranked to begin with are happening just on these three servers and explain the player decline in these three servers? It's not that much is part of the problem. So let's say that, again, and this is being generous, half of those accounts that are being banned are happening on NA, EU West, and Korea. We're dropping again from 260,000 accounts to 130,000 accounts. Well, again, if we've seen 130,000 accounts getting banned on NA, EU, and Korea, and then it gets divided between these three servers, technically it should be more proportional. So more of them are going to happen to Korea, more of them are going to happen to EU, whatever, less to NA. But still, you're talking about what, like 40, 50,000, banned accounts that are associated with ranked in each of these regions. That doesn't explain. I mean, we're seeing here, look, this is what kind of drops are we seeing here? 400,000 in EU. This was what is this, 800,000? Is that right? 800,000 drop. Here we're seeing, and this is a massive number, like 900,000. Obviously we've seen here 700,000 from 2016, 400,000 from 2016, 400,000 from 2016. So the drops that we're seeing, frankly, are not accounted for by them banning bots. Now, that's my opinion. If we were to estimate things, obviously those estimates aren't perfect. If you do believe that it's closer to like 80, 90, or 100% of the accounts that are being banned for being botted are going into ranked, because that's the only reason really why you would do that, is to level an account for ranked, maybe that's correct. But then you're doubling from, okay, instead of NA seeing 50,000 accounts banned per year associated with ranked that are botted, you're seeing 100,000. But then you're just going from, that doesn't explain a 400,000 drop. It's not even, it's significant. It matters. And it's an important thought. But it's not even the main cause here. The main cause is people just leaving the game, which is the bigger issue. And hopefully we're showing that here. So let's think about this. So the botted accounts, right, are significant, but they're not the main reason why we're seeing these declines. They don't account for enough of it, even if you were to assume 100%, of the botted accounts were associated with ranked. Once you think about how few of those are actually happening on NA, EU, and Korea specifically, they don't explain the big drops that we're seeing. So Yes, maybe there's a little bit of less smurfing because botted accounts are being banned. Yes, there's less players because of that. Oh, another thing that's worth noting here. Yes, they ban the botted accounts. They will make more botted accounts though, right? So that's kind of the other counter to this is even if they ban, 50,000 botted accounts in ranked in NA, if they produce and sell another 50,000 botted accounts in NA, then, that's another huge chunk of accounts that are coming back onto the market to counter that, right? Because you're not going to see this consistent decline and reducing the number of bot accounts available every year. They're probably just going to make more so that they always have enough to sell. The other thing we were talking about is inventory. A lot of times these companies and websites are sitting on thousands of level 30 accounts that they're waiting to sell and unload, that are being preemptively banned before they get sold. So they're not eliminating any person's particular account. Here's another factor that also matters a lot that I realized about these botted accounts. If you have an account that ends up being banned, you can still see your rank and you will still show up on the leaderboard as long as you've completed your placement matches. So let's say that in 2024, they banned 50,000 accounts, but 45,000 of those finished their placement matches before they got banned. All of those accounts still count in this number and still show up on the leaderboard even after they're banned. So that doesn't, so there's a lot of reasons why the botted accounts doesn't explain this, and maybe doesn't even account for as much as we were saying it does. So there's a lot to take into consideration there. Somebody said like, even if League had 1,000 players, it'd still be playable. So who cares? No, right? Obviously you have, different ranks. Somebody asked a better version of this question, which was, at what point does this break like a critical mass where we have so few players that the game becomes more difficult to play because of the lack of players? And what we experience is we experience queue times. So somebody else pointed out that they've been playing in Oceania, and there are so few players on the Oceania server that even in Emerald Plus, they're experiencing 7 to 8 minute queue times, which is so slow. It's to the point where you might expect that people might kind of not want to play as much if you're an Emerald player and you're having to wait 8 minutes for a game. So I want to take a look at how many players are in Oceania. So you have like 140,000. So if NA, for example, had 140,000 players, we would be experiencing the exact same situation. We would be experiencing these, 7 or 8 minute queue times, more autofills and stuff like that for Emerald. And then you can imagine what it's like in even higher tiers than that. It becomes pretty unplayable. So, that's a pretty low number. Obviously, NA is nowhere near 139,000, but I'm sure there are similar stories from other minor regions. Let's see if we can, like for example, Latin America North, they may have similar queue times, or maybe slightly better than Osh, with even still with having 500,000 players. So really, it's hard for me to say exactly because I don't know exactly what the effect on queue times would be. But I would definitely say that if you see your player count drop even below 1 million, there are so many players at different MMRs and different ranks and different roles that people are queuing up for, that to put a nice game together becomes more and more difficult. So quality matchmaking in a reasonable amount of time, which ensures reasonable queue times, becomes very difficult if you even drop to a reasonably low amount of players. Even 100, 200,000 players is way too low, and makes the game miserable even for your average, player. So that's important to keep in mind. Now, I don't think we're anywhere near reaching like a critical mass where queue times are going to be so long because there's so few players that it's really unplayable or anything like that. But of course, there is a road to get there. There is like, it has to start somewhere. And I don't think anyone should accept that the game should be experiencing multiple years of negative double-digit decline in its ranked player base when Riot can obviously just do better and deliver a better game, a better product that more people enjoy and are willing to put time into. So, just wanted to cover that. The other thing was people were talking about like, well, what did Arcane do? Now, I'm sure Arcane had a positive effect, and most of its effect probably would have been on the normal game player base, not the ranked player base, right? Because a lot of people who watched Arcane and tried League or even stayed playing League probably were more casual players, right? So I don't think there were a lot of new ranked players because of Arcane. However, there were probably a lot, like, it's complicated. We probably saw thousands or tens of thousands of new people eventually level up and get into ranked because of Arcane, but it was overshadowed by the fact that the game was declining so much during these time periods where Arcane released that it actually ended up not really being noticeable here at all. So people were talking about like, well, what about like the Arcane boost? Is the reason why the numbers were high last year or something like that because of an Arcane boost? Well, Arcane came out, the first season launched in November of 2021. And yet in 2021, we saw, basically no growth, negative growth between 2020 and 2021 in NA, and basically very low growth or no growth in EU and Korea. And then in 2022, since this would have been mostly, in effect after this, especially since this is when the first episode launched, so we would expect this effect to be afterwards, we saw negative 1% growth in NA, 3% growth in EU, and negative 11% growth in Korea. Now, again, maybe we would have experienced a negative 8% growth in NA, and maybe EU would have had negative growth in 2022 if it wasn't for Arcane in ranked. So obviously Arcane probably had a huge positive effect, but not enough to produce, great numbers or anything like that, because the amount of people leaving the game was enough to basically offset any new growth you had from Arcane. And then Arcane Season 2 came out in November of 2024, so in this time frame. And again, we've seen just a lot of declines since November of 2024. Like, for example, so the second split of last year of 2024, season 14, ended in September. Arcane came out in November, and then the third split ended in January of 2025. But in Korea, we saw negative 28% growth compared to the previous year, compared to 2023 for that last split. And, when we looked at like the May to May numbers, since we don't have a lot of recent numbers here, we obviously know that since last year, we've had some pretty steep declines May to May, and there's a lot of reasons for that. That was right before the end of a ranked season, so these numbers are a little bit inflated. But Arcane Season 2 is obviously a sort of, maybe we're waiting on the data, but sort of similar situation where I think it looks like the decline that the game is experiencing is overwhelming any positive impact that Arcane is having. So that's what's going on with any sort of Arcane boost. And then we've kind of talked about China. I'd really love to compare China to these regions as well, but unfortunately there's not a lot of easy access to data on what's going on with China in the same way that we get with OP.GG. Now we should really talk about what actually is wrong with the game, what's driving people away from the game, and what can be done about it. And there's a lot of issues, and I've just listed some of them here. Most of these are drawn straight up from, some of them I've come up with, some of them I've mostly drawn straight from the comments of the last video on people agreeing that there's a decline and that it's because people are leaving the game for one reason or another. So here's what I want us to really think about when it comes to this. What made League amazing in the first place? And also, we'll get into this, but what are the risks of, making massive changes to the game? So in my opinion, one of the things that League did really well in the beginning, when it was experiencing huge periods of growth that we see before these numbers here, back in, season 2, season 3, season 4, etc., the growth that we were seeing there, which I imagine for EU we can see went even through all the way into 2016 to 2017. So what I imagine there is that League did something really, really smart, and advanced for the time, which was, and there were other games doing it too, League just did it really well, which was you took a game like a World of Warcraft and you essentially sped that game up. And this is what the Warcraft 3 mod that spawned MOBAs really did. But essentially, you've taken the whole experience of playing this big MMO and you've condensed it into this really fun short mode, so that rather than having to dedicate, literal days or weeks IRL to leveling a character to fight a boss or something one time, instead in 20 minutes you can go through a super TikTok brain, super fast sped up version of that, where in 30 minutes you can take your character from level 1 to max level, get access to new abilities, buy items with gold that you farmed, level up, and and get stronger and more stats and stuff like that. It's basically taking that MMO experience at its essence and crunching it down into a fun, fast version of an MMO. You get to work with players on your team to take down, bosses and stuff like you would in an MMO. And to top it all off, you're also fighting against an enemy team that's trying to do the same thing. And so you actually have a team game and an element of competition directly with other players, PvP, rather than just a PvE experience. So really, it's a very good concept because you've taken this thing that's really takes too long for what it is, and a lot of people don't have time for, or is too hardcore, and makes it more accessible by making it a short, sweet, fun version of that. Now, the issue is that League, I think, had captured that, making it a fun, fast experience. And I think League is now in a position where, as media has become faster and faster and faster, especially for a younger generation, I think that League is that old, slow game now. And not everyone feels that way. There were plenty of people saying that they feel, that they really enjoy League because of how slow paced it is, and that you have time to think and to strategize, and that you're not just brain rot, like constantly shooting or doing something perma. It is nice that League is a slower paced game. And this is where I want to talk about risk of massive change. I'm really torn between two directions. One direction is like return to what made League good in the first place, and that being a complicated, slow-paced game that requires a lot of strategy, that gives players a huge amount of options compared to other games for self-expression and that sort of thing, that creates a lot of mystery, and you have to learn so much stuff that it's a never-ending learning process and experience. That's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is that if League wants to survive, the older players who want option number one, a lot of the older players who want option number one are going to age out of the game naturally anyways. They're working, they're having families and kids, they're studying and focusing on college and things like that. And so a lot of these players have just naturally aged out of the game entirely, or maybe they don't play as much, or maybe they don't maintain as many ranked accounts as they used to. And that's where we're seeing a lot of this decline. Now, that decline wouldn't happen if it was made up for by a bunch of new, younger players coming in. And that's what you have to do in order for a game, if League wants to survive for 20, 30, 40 years as this kind of generational game, which they've talked about before. In order to do that, you need new, young players coming in. But League is getting outcompeted by Fortnite and Roblox and Minecraft and even Marvel Rivals and these other just faster paced or even single player, not fast paced games that are just offering something completely different. And how does League compete for those new younger players? It's the opposite direction. It's rather than making the game more complicated, adding more and more to learn, a lot of people are saying, well, the game's too complicated for new players to learn. There's too many champions. The champions that do exist in the game are too complicated. You go to read their Wikipedia page and they've got 10 parts to their abilities that don't really even affect the champion's power level that much and add like 0.5% to the champion's win rate overall. Riot could probably just remove it and add a little bit of damage to, their basic ability, functionality, get rid of a passive here or there, and all of a sudden you've simplified the game to a point where people can actually learn it again. And then maybe you see some new players coming in. So you've kind of got this balance here between, do we take a huge risk on turning off all the players who are still playing the game, and there's still millions of players who are dedicated to playing the game, so it's not like the game's dead, it's just experiencing a huge decline at the moment over the last couple of years. When we see this huge decline, do we risk changing the game fundamentally to make it easier to bring new players into the game? Or do we return to basics and all of the things that I think made League good in the beginning? But you can't exactly go back to the beginning. I mean, the game's grown. There's too many champions in the game. There's too much data available. The mystery's gone, right? Even for a new player, when you're just able to look up what to go and things like that. So it's a tough decision, but I'll talk about some ideas either direction. We've kind of talked about what I thought made League great. You have both this element of it speeding up and actually being a fast-paced game at the time. In some ways compared to like an MMO. Now, actually at the time, each League match was much longer than it is today. So Riot has already moved in this direction, to be clear. Like, Riot has already tried to shorten game times, make the game faster paced and more exciting, added more objectives so that there's less downtime between them. They've even done things like given everybody home guards for free super early, and when you die, reduce death timers, all kinds of things like that to try to make the game faster. Also, there's been a ton of like mana creep, just like nothing costing any mana, never running like a bunch of extra ability haste and abilities having like very low cooldowns and extra mobility. In many ways, I call it the Earthification of League. I think Earth is League's future in some ways. So that's the difference here. Do we want League to become like Earth to appeal to the Zoomers, bring in new players to replace all these old players who are leaving and naturally aging out of the game? Or do we want League to remain the same, maybe make a few tweaks to maybe even make it more complicated or bring it back to the way that it was before, that was so engaging and interesting in the first place, but we risk just alienating any potential new players? That's kind of where we're at, right? I call it the Earthification of League. Death timers shortened, everybody moves super fast, no mana, like it's just Earth. All the comeback mechanics and things like that. Another huge criticism is that it's just hard for new players to learn or too complicated. I think about it like this. In a recent video, Jibei was talking about how when he was first learning League, one of the things that he experienced was that League had like 40, 50, 60 different champions. And he thought that was amazing because when other games had 20 or 30, he felt like League gave you more options than any other game did. And there was way more to learn, and that you were going to be engaged for a lot longer with a game that was more complicated like that because of the vast amount of content that there was with so many different champions in the game. But I think that there's a sweet spot. If other games like Overwatch, Marvel Rivals, whatever the case may be, if other similar competitive games have, 20 or 30 characters, but League has 40 or 50, I think that that's a good thing for League because it adds a little bit more depth to the game, and it adds a little bit more champions so that you have a better chance of finding a champion that you synergize really well with, that fits you really well. There's a little bit better chance of that, while not adding very much extra to learn compared to those other games. So the depth that you get and the ability to find something that fits you better is worth the little bit of extra learning that you have to do, 10 or 20 extra characters. But when League is 160 champions, because it's so many years old, then it becomes like, okay, but what other games have 160 champions? Like, we may have gone off the deep end, right? Like this is just way too many. Because now we're not talking about a learning curve between Marvel Rivals and League of 30 champions versus 40 or 50. We're talking about, oh, I could learn 30 characters in that game and understand the game really well, or I could spend 3 years trying to learn 160 champions in League. And it's just not fair to newer players, right? Like older players who have been learning them one at a time, for 10 years, who came in and initially had to learn 30 or 40 that they didn't know, but then just picked up, one, every couple of months, or, even recently, like one a year or two or three a year. That's a lot easier than coming in and having to learn 160 champions all at once. It's almost an impossible ask to ask new players to do that. So that's really bad. I mean, even we'll talk about like a tutorial and stuff like that for new players. Maybe we should even talk about it now with, talking about new players. But what are you going to do? I mean, even with a good tutorial, that's not going to teach people 160 different champions. It's just the game is getting too bulky. And again, you can't just go removing champions. How many people are going to quit if you remove their main champion? Or like, why did you remove my main champion instead of somebody else's main champion? Like, that just sucks. So you don't want people's champions to be removed either. So what do you even do? You also can't really split League between like a League Classic and a current League, because again, you split the player base in half, and now your queue times go up. And matchmaking quality gets a lot worse. And it's not like the state of the game back then was nice and balanced anyways. And so if they had to rebalance it, even if they tried to keep it, authentic to that version of the game while balancing it or something like that, you're going to really want to play the same meta and the same game with no changes for like forever instead of continuing to play the game with changes? I don't know. Hard to say. Like I said, I think League is slow paced now compared to other games, which is crazy. So I had that experience personally myself when I went to play Marvel Rivals for a little bit. I came back to playing League, and I had been playing DPS in Marvel Rivals, and it actually felt like my character was moving so slow when I was playing League. Like, just movement speed felt super slow. And there's something about that, like little things, helped League become popular, like we were talking about before. League was like the iPhone of MOBAs, like no turn speed compared to Dota, right? Seems like a really little dumb thing, like, oh, your character takes a half a second to turn around and before they can do something instead of instantly doing it. That felt really clunky to a lot of people when they tried Dota. And so League stood out as like, oh, it doesn't feel as bad. It doesn't feel clunky. It feels smooth. It feels fast. And to be honest, I feel like when I go and play other games, these modern Zoomer games, I feel like Marvel Rivals makes you feel like the game is smoother and faster than a game like League. But what are you going to do? It's just a different experience. So I don't know how League can compete with that. You're not just going to give everyone 100 movement speed. I mean, if you did something like that, the game would be bonkers, right? So I don't think that you can do that. I don't think that you want to turn the game into actually just URF. So it's very difficult how you URFify the game without turning it into URF, if you want to go that direction. The game's toxic. I mean, that is what it is, I mean, I think League's been toxic for a while, so I don't know that that's stopping people now or causing people to quit now. I think that the game's been toxic. But certainly when you're talking about like, oh, well, maybe these percentages of players that are leaving, right, or older players who are leaving, they know it's toxic. But new players also have heard that League is toxic, and maybe new players are scared off because of the toxicity, or don't even try the game because of how toxic they hear that it is. And if that's the case, that's obviously a problem. But what are you going to do about that? I mean, obviously Riot's tried to crack down on people being toxic. I guess they just do more of that. I mean, what can you really do about people being toxic, right? I've been saying this for a long time. I actually don't mind people being too toxic. I think that there are levels to it, and that it depends on the elo that you're at. I think that more toxicity should be allowed the higher rank you go, and less toxicity should be tolerated the lower rank you go, and no toxicity or very little should be tolerated in normal games. and toxicity can also mean other things. Like, obviously, the word toxic is like the most extreme version of this, but I also mean just like bantering, swearing, things like that. I think that these things are okay in moderate amounts. I just think that they should be allowed less at lower ranks and less in a casual game setting, because I think those players expect, it's about expectations. Those players expect a more friendly game, a less competitive game, a less toxic game. Whereas you get higher up and you get more dedicated to the game, you've put in more hours, everyone cares about the game more. And I think naturally you are going to expect that people's passions and tensions are going to run high, and that the banter is going to be higher and stuff like that. And you expect a certain higher level of toxicity the higher up you go. That's just me though, that's my personal opinion. But I think that obviously if you could eliminate toxicity for normal games, that would be quite helpful. I definitely think that their system where they've been like forcing people to play normal games if they get in trouble in ranked, that is really bad for normal game toxicity levels, because, you know, you do not want the player who is really tilted about ranked and now has to play 3 normal games with people who are well below their rank. You do not want that person going into those people's normal game. I mean, imagine you're a new player like leveling up, maybe playing with a friend or something, you get that guy in your game. And now all of a sudden this toxic player is like thrown into your normal game. I mean, that just can't be healthy for the game. People aging out of the game with no new replacements. We've kind of been talking about that. I think this is a big one, but it hasn't really changed a whole lot over the years, so I don't think it would drive these recent declines. But I think one of the biggest problems by far that I've seen across all my videos that people have with League, bar none, is autofill, champion select. Queue times is a minor issue related to these things, but mostly it's champion select and autofill. We've been talking about this quite extensively in like the losers queue video, and I've been trying to explain this to people. And there's always going to be some people who are going to agree with this, and understand where I'm coming from, or are open-minded enough to listen to this. And then there are people who will never change their mind on this whatsoever. But I'm trying to help you either way. There is a perception that League has like the worst matchmaking ever. And I think that the important thing is that even if the perception is just a perception and it's kind of wrong, and I'll explain the reason why it's wrong, but even if it's wrong, if people have that perception to such an extreme, and so many people have it that it's a very commonly held collective belief, Riot needs to do something to fix it, even if it's just a perception. That's just, at the end of the day, that's what needs to be done. The reason for that is because people will quit the game, people will hate the game, if they feel like it's not fun and not fair, even if it is fair. The reason why this particular thing is so controversial is because people don't want to admit how much agency and control they have over their own games. But I won't get into all of that. Let's just say, suffice to say, that matchmaking is balanced until champion select starts, for the most part. So when the game tries to match teams together, it does a pretty good job of making sure that the teams are within such MMR average of each other that there's only about a 1% difference in the win rate that the MMR calculation or the ELO calculation would expect from those two MMR teams playing versus each other. However, when you get into champion select, people can pick all kinds of random champions. Even before champion select, actually, but the matchmaking doesn't take this into account. If somebody mains support and queues up for AD carry because they're tilted at their AD carry from last game and they want to show that they can play AD carry, or they're, people do this with jungle all the time. They're tilted about the way that their junglers have been playing. They want to show how easy it is. If you queue up for a role that you don't play, or someone queues up for a role that they don't play, the matchmaking gets really screwed up for a lot of reasons once you start getting into champion select, because you have all these variable problems. Like, you've got all these champions that are getting banned that Riot has no control over, and the matchmaking doesn't have any control over. So now all of a sudden you match someone against a team that happens to ban Braum that game. Well, now your team is at a major disadvantage because your support plays Braum. So Now all of a sudden your chances of winning aren't 51 to 49%. Maybe your chances went from 51 to 49% to you have a 45% chance of winning because one champion got banned. That's a huge problem. And that's just one tiny thing that can go wrong. Somebody can pick away your champion, somebody or your team's champion. They can pick champions that all counter your champions in lane or as a team in team fights. You could pick champions that have no synergy with each other or just happen to main champions that have no synergy with each other. You can pick champions that you don't have enough experience on to do well or aren't necessarily reflective of the ELO or MMR that you were matched based off of. So if your rank is a culmination of you playing 90% Xin Zhao in jungle and 10% Nocturne, and you pick Kha'Zix for the first time, all of the sudden your rank that they use to match you with in that game is almost meaningless when it comes to how well you're going to play Kha'Zix, because champions are so different from each other that you almost ought to have a rank for each champion. We can talk about why that doesn't exactly work, but you run into some huge issues with people just picking champions they don't know how to play. So all of a sudden you can get through champion select and easily all the time have games that are actually 60-40 or 70-30 or 80-20 or whatever. And that's why games feel, or one of the reasons why games feel like the matchmaking is terrible. Because the second you get into the game and start playing, something's wrong. My jungler's playing like he's 2 ranks below what the level of play that I'm used to. What's going on with that? You look it up. Oh, of course, my jungler's autofilled. Oh, of course, my jungler picked a champion he's never played before. Whatever the case may be, right? And it's just an unfortunate reality of the way that champion select works. Now you have other problems there as well, like the game is snowbally, we've talked about before. So imagine you make it through champion select, you have 2 teams that are going to win 50-50 against each other, and they manage to get through champion select somehow with bans and picks that are still pretty 50-50. Once you get into game, if you ran 1,000 games or 100 games, each team would win 50 or each team would win 500 on 1,000 games versus each other. But you only play that one match. So now you play that one match. What actually happens in the games that they play? Like if you ran 1,000 games between these teams, do you think that every game is 50-50? No, League's a snowbally game. Some games, 2 evenly matched teams versus each other, one team's going to get out to a huge lead early and stomp the other team. And then, another game, the other team's going to get out to a huge lead early and stomp the other team. Now, if you have a true 50-50 and draft goes 50-50, you are going to have more games that are kind of 50-50 in game than you would normally see between 2 teams that weren't balanced, obviously. But there are going to be plenty of snowbally one-sided games, even between 2 teams who are evenly matched. So between the fact that you have players who are auto-filled, picking champions that they don't know how to play, lack of synergy, too many AD champions, too many AP champions, enemy teams picking away your champions, people first timing stuff, people getting into game and then the game just snowballs one way or another, people queuing for the wrong role that they don't actually play for fun or because they want to try to play a different role that day or because they are mad at, some role and they want to show that they can do it better or whatever the case may be. There's a million ways in which this can go wrong, and on top of that it snowballs on top of itself even further because, as we talked about in the losers queue video, in statistics, the more variance that there is between games, like if you have a bunch of 80-20 games, some games are 80% in favor of you winning for free and only 20% that the enemy team is going to win. Some games you have a 20% chance and you're basically doomed. When that's the case, you actually have a higher percentage chance of there being like streaks. And streaks in League are even more complicated because of the way that the MMR system works. When you go on a winning streak, your MMR goes up because you've won a bunch of games, which means you get harder matches, right, where the enemy team is better and your teammates are better, but they're harder matches because they're at a higher level, and you actually tend to lose unless you've really improved. So if you just happen to go on a lucky streak up, you're probably going to go on an unlucky streak down. That's called reverting to the mean. So what is essentially happening here is the fact that there's high variance in champion select and the snowbally nature of the game and things like that leads to more streakiness, which leads to more streakiness because when you go on a streak down and your games get easier, you'll be likely to go on a streak up, or more likely to go on a streak up. And when you go on a streak up, you're more likely to go on a streak down because you've gone too high. And so it's this cycle of vicious winner's queue and loser's queue, not intentionally, but statistically, because of the fact that you're tilting constantly and then having these huge periods of highs where you're playing well on top of the high variance that just naturally exist in the game. So statistically, you're going to get, obviously, like we've talked about before, a lot higher chance of a 10-game winning streak than 1 in 1,024, and a lot higher chance of a 10-game losing streak than 1 in 1,024 because of those things. So you add all those things together, but here's what happens then. The perception from players is, well, the matchmaking just sucks, because I can look at the live feature for my game, and in about 20 seconds, I can calculate the probability that my team is going to win pretty accurately, and I basically know whether I'm going to win or lose the game after we finish Champion Select before anyone started playing. Now, that's not always the case, right? Sometimes I'll be surprised. But that's statistics. Maybe, of course, if you have a 10 or 20% chance of winning, 10 or 20% of the time you're going to win, that doesn't mean the matchmaking doesn't feel awful for everyone. So the issue here is that the freedom that people have in Champion Select, and queuing whatever role they want, even though it's not their main role, picking whatever champion they want, even though it's not their main champion, or the champions that reflect the rank that they've gotten to, all of this freedom, and then the snowbally nature of the game, all of this freedom and the Champion Select system in general makes the matchmaking feel bad, even though all the matchmaking did was, put 5 players versus 5 players who are similar average MMR to each other, and tried to get them on roll, tried to get role parity and stuff like that the best that it could. Even when you see that there's not role parity, and I'm not saying that it does a perfect job with that, sometimes it messes it up. But sometimes even when you see, like I showed an example of this in the Losers Queue video, sometimes when you see uneven role parity, it's just because somebody didn't queue the role that they main. Oh, my support main queued up for mid, and so the reason why we have 2 field players on our team is because one of our teammates decided to fill himself this game instead of the system doing it. So the system assumes that person plays mid. Now that's a flaw in the system, right? If you're a 2,000 rated player on support, should you be able to queue up as a 2,000 rated mid player? Absolutely not, right? That doesn't make any sense. So that's the issue here. So how do you fix it? Well, it's really complicated, and that's where people get frustrated too, because they think, well, regardless, if this problem exists that creates all this variance and stuff like that, Riot could do something to fix it, surely. Or they could match around it. Like people have suggested, like, well, they know what champion you ban. They know what champion you're likely to pick or likely to ban. So Riot can just match you based on that information, and it'll be fine. The problem is that they don't actually know in each individual game whether you're going to do anything or not. So for example, and it actually already kind of does match you like that. So again, take that example where I said there was a jungler and like 90% of their ranked games were on Xin Zhao and 10% of their ranked games were on Nocturne, and they first time Kha'Zix. Let's stick with that example for a second. Well, when that player's getting matched, they are getting matched off of the fact that 90% of their games are Xin Zhao. Their MMR is a culmination of their win percentage on Xin Zhao, how good they are on Xin Zhao, times or basically accounting for the prevalence of them picking Xin Zhao, which is 90% of the time. And then it's affected by their Nocturne, which they pick 10% of the time. So their win rate on Nocturne weighted for 10% of their games. So their MMR is actually a reflection of what champions they pick. So a player who is more likely to pick a champion that they've never played before in a random role is actually likely to have lower MMR, and therefore be less likely to be in the same rank. The problem is that doesn't fix it entirely, of course, because if first off, when you do that for the first time, there's no accounting for that. And so you could be 90%, Xin Zhao, 10% Nocturne. When you first time that Kha'Zix, I mean, the rank system has no idea that that's going to happen. It doesn't put them in a lower elo lobby because it expected them to pick a champion they've never picked before. So there's no way to predict that. It's just a consequence of free will, basically. So that's really difficult to deal with, isn't it? Now, again, you could get rid of champion select, but then what would you do instead? So I've thought about like, well, you could have like swift play, but for ranked, where you're only picking two champions, or maybe you could let people pick three or whatever, but you like limit the number of champions that they queue up expecting to play against or to play with. I mean, but then you have to deal with things like, okay, but you've just eliminated champion select, which is a core mechanic of the game, pretty fundamental to the game for many, many years. I think it would be worth it. Honestly, I think champion select sucks so much for a lot of reasons, but it's a radical change. So again, risk of massive change here. I think it could potentially be a good idea to remove champion select. Here's why. Champion select takes a huge amount of time, especially when people dodge, right? Every champion select takes like 5 minutes on top of your queue, and it's one of the reasons why people can't play as much League games as they want, and it's one of the reasons why League is a slower game compared to other games, because it takes so long to just play, and people who want to just be playing constantly can't, because between long queue times, champion select, and loading screen, you can spend easily a huge amount of time. And I don't just mean at high elo, I even mean at low ranks, because champion select is the same amount of time to pick. You can spend just too much time for a more casual player to want to spend 10 minutes to get into every game. It just doesn't make sense for a gold player to wait 4 minutes to get into the game, 5 minutes in champion select, and a minute for loading screen. They can't wait 10 minutes between every game. It's just bad. I get that it's been in the game for a long time. There's a lot of skill expression through champion select, but it needs to be replaced. It's creating all of the variants and problems that we see with the rank system that people complain about, their perception about it. Again, I don't mind it personally as a player. You have your games where you're very likely to win. You have your games where you're very likely to lose. You have your games that are more 50-50. As a player, right, trying to climb in ranked, it's a marathon, not a sprint. You got to play a large sample size of games, and you got to do well in the games that you have the ability to impact the outcome of. And, you have to try to keep a cool head in the games that you don't have the ability to impact the outcome of, and you're losing, or even your team wins it for you because you kept a good mental instead of crashing out and losing your team the game. So it's kind of a fundamental part of playing a game like League, but obviously some players just can't handle that. So if you could make a system that puts people into game with a more 50-50 match by matching people based on champions, based on what champion they picked and how much experience they have on it, something like that could work. But it's difficult to implement. It would be very different. It's a massive change that would fundamentally change the game. So imagine you had swift play, you could queue up for two champions. Maybe there was even a minimum mastery requirement to discourage smurfing and to sort of help prevent people from picking champions that they have completely no clue what to play. You let people pick one ban, and then they would just never match against people who have queued for that champion that you've selected to ban. That's fine, right? It may seem kind of like broken, or that you could never play against certain players by banning a champion, but you effectively don't play against that champion anyways by banning that champion. So I don't think it makes a big deal. And in lower ranks, not playing against some specific player probably doesn't matter. It could be a little bit weird for higher ranks, right? So that is kind of an issue, but you got to figure it out somehow. But if you wanted to have bans, you could do that, or you could just have no bans, would also work. But that might not be as fun, right? People like bans so that they can avoid playing certain champions they don't find fun to play against. Autofill needs to be reduced, especially I'll tell you how to do it actually in high and low elo. I don't understand why autofill is even as prevalent as it is in low elo to begin with, right? They say it's queue times, but I'm telling you the queue time for masters is 4 minutes and the queue time for gold is 4 minutes. It doesn't make any sense why that's the case. And I'll tell you multiple reasons why, right? The queue time for gold could be, it just doesn't make sense that they're the same queue time. It's like there's more players queuing in gold and bronze and silver, whatever. So just like put the match together and don't autofill the players. I don't know if they've put too many other restrictions, like in terms of, I know they did restrictions on the face ranks being close to each other and stuff like that. They have to deal with a lot more duoing down there, but it just doesn't make sense to me that it, like silver or something like that, you'd be often autofilling players. It just doesn't make any sense. And then in higher ranks like Masters Plus, the queue times actually should be a little bit longer. So I've talked about this before, but queue times in really high ranks in Masters Plus, they used to be super long, like an hour long, and people would complain because that's ridiculous. I can't wait an hour to play a 30-minute game. That doesn't make any sense, and it's like super hard to climb when you can barely play. I agree with that, but it doesn't need to be 4 minutes either for queuing in Masters. There's no reason why it shouldn't be like 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 minutes in Masters, with the understanding that by making it 7 minutes, 8 minutes a game in Masters, you're having the number of autofilled players that are necessary. And then that increases the game quality of high elo games by a lot. Now, I don't know what to do for low elo, because if decreasing the number of autofill players in like silver, bronze, gold, whatever, if that increases queue times to 7 or 8 minutes, then we're already, as we've talked about here, getting back to the original point of the video with the player count, we've already dropped the player count enough that we have a significant problem on our hands. We don't have a big enough player base to support roll queue and low elo even, because we need autofill in order to make it work, because we don't have the player base that we used to. That's crazy, right? But that may be where we're at, because honestly, you should be able to match a match in gold in 4 minutes without autofilling anyone. So if they can't do that, that just means that the player base has already declined enough that the player base decline is causing more autofills to happen. And that's causing lower game quality, which is potentially causing more people to quit in a negative vicious cycle. So that's really bad, right? So they need to get rid of autofill, frankly. I know that's really harsh. I know it does a lot to queue times that is really bad. They need to get rid of autofill. There's nothing, even with autofill parity, there's nothing that adds more variability to a game than people picking a random champion they don't know how to play, or their main champion or one trick getting banned, or people getting autofilled to a role that they have no idea how to play. Especially jungle and support getting autofilled to jungle or getting autofilled to support. There's nothing worse than that at all. Or a support player getting autofilled. But, that's a whole different thing. The point is that these things cause that variance that people blame matchmaking for and think that the game is like rigged and terrible. And I've seen that sentiment be so prevalent that I think that even though over the long run it is pretty 50-50 between your games, and you've got to have an impact on the ones you can, you've got to try to learn from your games and improve and get better so that you can impact more and more games, and then you'll climb eventually. Obviously, that if that wasn't the case, people like me wouldn't have been able, and other high elo players wouldn't have been able to climb to where we've gotten to, wouldn't be able to consistently go on Smurf accounts and win, 60, 70, 80, 90% of our games. Wouldn't be able to do that if it wasn't a skill-based matchmaking system. So obviously it's a skill-based matchmaking system, but the perception that it's not is going to kill the game, because it's a competitive game that needs to have a strong confidence that is the best competitive matchmaking system out there. And if champion select and that variance that it's adding is ruining that, maybe champion select has to go. So let's talk about this a little bit further. It's really complicated though. There's not a great solution to it. Even if you go with like that swift play mode where you select 2 champions, how are you going to limit what champions and roles those people can select? That's a very difficult question. There are some people who actually do play 2 roles at an equal level, or maybe want to play 2 roles, and they're learning and starting out, and they're not really much better or worse at one than the other. Are people going to be locked into only playing 1 role? Are you going to have a different rank for each role? That might be nice and reduce the number of Smurf accounts, right? If you could just have a different rank for each role all on your main. But, I don't see why Riot would necessarily want to do that when, of course, they make more money by selling more skins and champions and XP boosts and stuff like that to people trying to level accounts. But you could have a rank for each role. You could have a rank for each champion. Here's the problem with having a rank for each champion, which is probably the best solution. Problem with having a rank for each champion is that it slows down your ranked climb, kind of like having 2 resets in a year or 3 resets in a year. It dramatically slows down your ranked climb because now if you play 1 champion, you're going to be climbing at the normal speed. Whereas if you play 3 champions, you're going to be climbing at 1/3 the speed. If you played 3 champions in equal amount, you'd be climbing at 1/3 the speed. And it's not necessarily even fair because a player who's actually getting good at 3 champions as opposed to just one, maybe in some ways is a more capable player overall than that one player, or that one player with 1 champion is. So that sort of seems like it sucks. Removing champion select also has a bunch of negative consequences for players who are able to counterpick their opponent and play a bunch of champions well. So take a player who can only play 1 champion, one trick, and then take a player who can play 20 different champions in top lane to counter whoever they want. The player who can play 20 different champions well really benefits from champion select because champion select allows them to use their broad champion pool and their skill at so many different champions in the game to create edges that win them more games. Whereas if you take that away and they just have to queue for 1 champion over and over again, or they switch what champion they're queuing for, but they don't know what matchup they're going into, that is really tough because they don't get to express that skill at all. Whereas a one trick who would normally get counterpicked a lot in champion select, or like half of their games, doesn't even have to worry about that at all. They just queue up every game, get their main champion into a random blind matchup. So that really sucks about removing champion select. The other thing is you're still going to have variance. If you go into a matchup blind, you're likely to end up into a matchup that's not very favorable to you, right? And champions that are better blind pickable are going to become much stronger and more OP and much more commonly picked than champions that maybe can only exist as a counter pick. What if a champion is really only good if it can be drafted after you see what your opponent is? And now all of a sudden you're picking a blind over and over again, you're just screwed. So there's a lot of issues there with why they can't really eliminate the variance that exists in champion select easily. So if you have like a rank for every champion or an MMR for every champion, people won't climb fast enough to enjoy the game. People will feel like it's a waste of time to do anything other than one trick because it's like, more of a competitive advantage to do so in solo queue, although it kind of already is. And, any time that you put into another champion isn't going to contribute to your main rank. So it's just a mess. In other words, there's not an easy way to just get rid of champion select and the variance involved in it in order to make the matchmaking feel better. It's really difficult to do. The game, by its very nature, is just too snowbally and has too many kind of one-sided options or situations that can occur. And so you're going to have a lot of games that are blowouts one way or another, and you just kind of have the mental fortitude to deal with it. But as I said before, this has always been the case. None of this has changed, right? So I don't think this is leading to the declines that we see. So people who are frustrated about the game may say that it's because of this variance in champion select or bad matchmaking or whatever you want to call it. But at the end of the day, I think that that's the thing that frustrated them most about League. But the reason why they left was because they aged out of the game and had other things that they needed to do rather than just being frustrated about the game. Although, of course, there's plenty of people who have left because they were frustrated too. But I think that that's a complaint that you hear that is sort of separate from this issue that's occurring the last couple of years. I think a lot of this, and I've talked about this before, I think a lot of the drop in player base these last couple of years has been just people have a ranked journey and they like to be able to make kind of some steady progress along their ranked journey. And a lot of players, either because they're not good enough or they're not learning fast enough, they get stagnant and then they quit. And that's just a natural part of what's going to happen to some people in the player base. But I think that last year and the year before last year, so 2023 and 2024, which were the years where we saw these unnaturally large declines as well, were years where we had the 2 splits per year and 3 splits per year. And as I've talked about before, that created just the most stagnant, most horrible ranked climb ever. And I'll show this. We're really deep into the video, so anyone still watching probably is very interested in this. like take a look at my account, right? So when we were having all these resets in last year's split 1, I ended 400 LP. Then split 2, I ended 400 LP. Then split 3, I ended 400 LP. So I ended like literally within less than 20 LP, like less than one game apart for 3 splits in a row. So I want you to guess then, if I ended, within one game of LP apart, how do you think I did? Like, how many wins over losses do you think I had between split 1 and split 2 and between, split 2 and split 3? Let's take a look. So split 1 on Braum, I had 20 more wins than losses. And there's some other stuff in here too, for sure. But I think if you add it up, we're positive 6 here on Nami. We're positive, let's see, we go to solo queue because there's some stuff here too. But we're like positive 5 games here on Nami. We're positive 5 games here on Nautilus, positive 2 on Maokai, positive 2 on Lulu, positive 4 on Rakan. We're negative 5 here on Sona. But I think if you add it up and we're positive 22 on Braum, I'm easily plus 20 games here on this split. Right? No progress. Okay, on to split 2. Boom. Another positive 15 games on Braum. We're positive, 9 on Leona. Positive 2 on Janna. Positive, 4 on Nautilus. Positive 2 on Lulu. I guess I'm like negative 3 on Kaisa, negative 2 on Nami. But again, add it all up, we're probably about plus 20 games again. Boom, go to split 3. Can even see, finally, this is the time when I think they added totals in. Boom, 166 and 141. I went positive 25 games. So during these splits right here, I actually went positive 20 games. Split 1, split 2, split 3. And I've added these up before, so I know. Positive 20 games plus for 3 splits in a row, and I gained 0 LP. And it's not like I was playing a little bit of League or something like that. Like, I played 300 games. So when you play 300 games, win 20 more than you lose, and gain 0 LP just to get reset right when you get back to where you were, it's the most miserable ranked experience they could have possibly devised, because they just have you trapped in a hamster wheel, which is why they finally reverted it, right? But this was just stupid. Honestly, I think a huge part of the decline was, frankly, players were stuck, even players who were good. So forget about the players who were bad, who would have done this, over the years, every year anyways, gotten stuck and then ended up quitting the game. We're talking about even players who were doing well were stuck for years. Those players just went away and ended up quitting the game. When you feel like, you had high hopes for League, you wanted to keep pressing and getting to a higher and higher rank, you put in hundreds of games, you won more than you lost, you did everything right, and you didn't get to see any progress whatsoever for the work that you put in, and then you got immediately reset back to like a rank or 2 below where you were, forget about it. And a lot of players who were, not able to play 300 games, they played 100 and then went down a rank, or they play, even though they won as much as they lost, or won more than they lost. And I've been explaining to people that if you come back now, right now that we have one reset a year again, Riot fixed their mistake, your MMR is still high, so you still have big MMR from all those wins over losses that can carry over into the season and help you climb higher than ever before this season. But it was a big fat mistake for Riot to put these multiple resets in. I mean, it did the opposite of increase player counts. It vastly decreased the amount of people who were interested in playing the game, because their rank journey was just completely artificially interrupted and frankly stopped or turned negative for no good reason other than Riot being greedy and wanting to churn, more games played, more hours played. And that was a really big mistake. So I think that that's a huge part of it as well. Let's see. Role balance, right? A lot of what people have been complaining, and again, I don't think this is necessarily why people have quit the game, but it is something that's gotten worse over the last couple of years, As I've been saying for a long time, I really think, and we talked about this in the jungle video, right? Why it's super hard to nerf jungle. If you slow down the camps by making them deal more damage to junglers, because I do think in general, the amount of damage that the camps deal to junglers feels pathetic. I mean, you're healing off of doing every camp. You walk up to any camp as a jungler, right, with 100 HP, once you're like a couple levels in, and you will just heal off of that camp and not be able to die. That seems ridiculous to someone who's a veteran of old League, where people would die at the jungle camps and stuff like that all the time because they did so much damage. But the reality is that if you were to make the jungle camps do more damage or be harder to take or slower to take, people would just opt into ganking junglers, which would frustrate laners even more. And so the reality is that, and someone made a really good comment on that video, the way to fix jungle is not to do anything to jungle. It's actually, if we feel like AD carry and mid lane and top lane are not having as much influence on the game as they should, we need to buff AD carry, top, and mid lane, not nerf jungle. And so that's the key to all of this. Is it's hard to nerf jungle without just shifting junglers into ganking all the time. But what you can do is you can buff AD carry items. You can make them cheaper. You can buff mage items and stuff like that. And look at what they're doing. This very recent last patch, boom, huge buffs to a bunch of mid lane mage items, right? I hope we see similar things coming to AD carry items. I know they took a pass at them earlier. Yuntal's been, much upgraded and, built a lot more, and it's good. Is it really giving AD carries everything that they need? I don't think so. But, it's a step in the right direction. So I think what they need to do is positive buffs to these other roles rather than taking away power from jungle and support. And if they leave jungle's influence the same, because it's hard to change the way that it works fundamentally, most of jungle's impact is just coming from the fundamental way that the role exists in the game. So what you have to do to compensate for that is not try to change or rework the whole jungle, but just buff AD carry items and mid lane items and stuff like that, or their champions or their gold or experience or something, so that they have the same overall influence. Because yes, junglers have a huge presence on impacting the map, same thing for supports, but if AD carries builds are accelerated by like a whole item or something like that, all of the sudden AD carries can have a huge impact on the game too, and now it's a little bit more balanced. Here's the other thing that I like about that, and League has gotten more like this. I think it'd be really cool if you could get to 6 items in League in like 30 minutes or 20 something minutes. That sounds kind of crazy and kind of radical, but if you just increase the amount of gold and XP in the game and sped up the pace of the game, I think it could be really, really good for the game. Why? Because as we were just talking about, League originally was a game that capitalized on being a faster and fun version of something else. And League is moving more and more towards a game that needs to be faster to keep people engaged, that young players and younger people in general want a faster and faster experience. And I think people also want to be able to play more games. And if you can't deal with the variance from Champion Select, well, at least if the games are shorter, you can play so many games that players who only have time for 100 ranked games in a season, if the games were half as long, now they have time for 200. And so now they can actually smooth some of that variance out rather than just quitting the game because they had a bad streak. That's really key as well. So imagine if you could get to that many items and then, early into the game, so you could experience so many things that you don't normally get to experience. You could experience your late game 6 item power spike fantasy more often, which is just fun, even for regular League players. You'd have faster paced games, which means more accurate ranked ladder where players who don't have as much time are able to play more games and have more impact on more matches in order to climb. You have an experience that's faster paced that appeases to younger players and maybe a younger player base. And also it's a buff to AD carries because AD carries scale really well into the late game. That's their domain. And it makes games more comebackable, which they've been pushing for. It adds more comebacks into games because once you get to 5 or 6 items, the difference in power between all of the champions diminishes quite a lot because they can't get any more power or items. So it's very similar to how in a CSGO you get to, after losing the pistol round and then you save for a round or two, you get to a buy round where both teams have more or less the exact same level of equipment. And so you're able to actually have a fair 50-50 shot every couple of rounds at winning a round. So there's a little bit of snowballing for a couple of rounds while you're having to save, but then you equalize. Well, League can't really do that exactly, but what you can do is if you just make it till 30 minutes or 33 minutes or something like that, you're likely to have a 50-50 chance of winning the game again because the other team didn't close out the game fast enough. You can do other things too. If you feel like moving that up speeds up the game too much with Baron being later, get rid of Rift Herald. Rift Herald's kind of useless. It's not so good after the nerfs, in my opinion. I think get rid of Rift Herald, right? Move Baron earlier. Try to, basically condense the game a little bit. They've already done that with getting rid of one of the grubs. I think that was a great change. Try to condense the game a little bit, even faster and faster paced. Maybe you'll see good things. Maybe it's, again, risk of massive change. Maybe it's too radical. Maybe a lot of people who currently play the game wouldn't like that. But I don't know. That's definitely one way that you could both do role balance, appeal to new, younger players, and potentially make the game more comebackable. Now, I have mixed feelings on all of these things, right? As a player who comes from the old 60-minute games, I'm not a super big fan of super fast early games because I actually like these long drawn out strategic games that go on forever, leading to like the most intense 1 hour long conclusion. Those games are bangers and are a lot more fun than every game being over at 30 minutes. But I get the direction that League's been headed in and where it has to go. So that's how I feel about, those super long games. I don't really like the comeback idea either. I get that it's like that in other sports. I get that it's like that in other games like CSGO or in Overwatch or Marvel Rivals. You get your ultimates all up. So if you all hold your ultimates, then you can go in on an even playing field with the other team. So I get that all these other games have situations for comebacks. But what's kind of cool about League is that it's unique in that you snowball on your opponent and get to beat them up because you played better than them early and you won and got ahead, or you cheesed and made something happen to get ahead. And I think to your veteran League player, what it sounds like when you add comeback mechanics into the game is not, well, we're trying to make the game more like other fun games where you can actually have a chance of coming back. There's a reason to keep playing instead of just FFing. If you make the game more comebackable, old veteran League players will say, well, this just feels like you're rewarding bad players and bad play by giving them a chance to come back and win against a team who was clearly doing better than them. But if it makes the games more competitive, if it makes matchmaking seem less bad because you have the ability to come back when your team's not doing so well, it could be fine, right? Like, who knows what League with like chances of a 50-50 for the losing team to win the game. Who knows what that would look like? Maybe it would be good. Maybe it would just be stupid. I don't know, but it could work. And that's definitely the direction they've been pushing in with reducing death timers, giving people home guards, especially when they die. All of this stuff is helping to mitigate, the mistakes of dying and stuff like that, like negative bounty gold, higher champion bounty gold, higher team and objective bounty gold that didn't even used to exist in the game anymore or before. There's so many things like that they've done. Item balance, I mean, we kind of talked about this in relation with role balance, but I would say that it's a similar conundrum here with items. You can go in many different directions. Do you want really big, impactful items, or do you want little items that just don't do very much? And I think the thing that was cool about Mythic items was that there were a lot of huge, impactful items that just added like crazy value to the game and just completely fundamentally warped and changed the way that the game was played. I still think there's items like that in the game for sure, but I think Mythic items was like peak crazy items being able to do stuff. And maybe that was just fun. Maybe it was just fun. Maybe it wasn't perfectly balanced, but maybe it was just fun. Should it have been dependent on you getting a bunch of like I think getting a few stats for completing other legendary items was not fun and didn't make any sense. But the idea of a core item that can do a whole lot, that is a really, really impactful item that acts like an ability or something like that, or adds a core part to your kit, I think that that's cool. Again, it adds to the learning curve though, because if items are just stat sticks, then you really just have to learn the champions. Whereas if items are like abilities, you got to learn all the items too, and that adds to the complication of the game for new players. But items, items can add a lot of fun to the game. We were also just talking about how like you can balance 80 carry items and mage items to be stronger, maybe even bruiser items and stuff like that. And tank items are quite strong to kind of mitigate some of the power deficit between roles as well. We've talked about like game time and stuff like that. I think it's funny because I have people in my comments complaining that games are too long, and league games, as far as I know, I mean, there have been times where they've been really short, but like overall, the main trend from like season 2 to now has been that game times have gotten shorter and shorter and shorter. And there have been times where they've spiked up. There have been times where they spiked down really short, but the overall trend has been that Riot is trying to make game time shorter and shorter and shorter for a long time, and they have been getting a lot shorter. So it is funny to me that people are still complaining that the game is too long, and that is interesting, and I think that maybe there's something to that. That's probably why the future of the game is more Earthification, more shorter games and stuff like that. Advertisements. Right, again, we talked about Arcane, right? How like Arcane probably had a positive bump, but overall the player base was still declining during that time. I honestly think that maybe Arcane, and again, it had a big impact probably more on normal game players, so we got to preface that. But for ranked at least, I think that their advertising campaign is focused on Arcane, and I've heard multiple people say that they used to see advertisements or got into League because they saw ads for the game. And it seems like they've pulled back because since a very long time ago, I haven't, and other people are saying that they haven't seen ads for the game, just traditional ads online, in a very long time. And maybe League thinks that it's saturated the market or something like that, and that pulling back ads makes sense. And that could be the case. But I wonder if every once in a while running a traditional ad campaign online would not be a good idea still for League. Remember that a lot of these younger players did not see the ads back in 2015 or 2016 or 2017 because they weren't around then. So if you want to draw in these new younger players, you're not advertising to the same people who already know League, heard about it, or have seen it. You're advertising in a lot of cases to people who have barely heard about it. Maybe they heard a little bit about it. Maybe they've seen Arcane, but that didn't, quite think about playing the game or didn't take the extra step to go do it, but they see an ad and then they click on it and actually download it. I'd like to see a bit of a, it doesn't have to be a huge spend, but I think that they should return to a little bit of traditional just, banner advertising and YouTube ads and things like that for the game. Voice comms. Okay. And this sort of relates to the second one too, or the last one after this, right? Which is, at the end of the day, League is a team game, and it is one of the few team games that does not have voice comms. They added it in Valorant. They, have it in Marvel Rivals and Overwatch. They have had it in CSGO for however many years that's been around, like 20 years or whatever. I don't know how long CSGO's had voice comms, but for as long as I can remember. So, I mean, it's time, right? Like, League needs something to spice it up and bring people back, and there is nothing that will spice it up and bring people back like voice comms. It also has a huge potential upside, which is honestly not only in high elo, but even in low elo, being able to communicate to your team, to get people on the same page, to know what you're even trying to do is really, really big. Because a lot of times there's so many little miscommunications that happen in League because people just aren't on the same page because they're playing their own game in solo queue and they're not even thinking about what their teammates are thinking about. When you have voice comms and just can focus on something together as a team and interact with your teammates as human beings, you'd be surprised. I think that the game will actually become a little bit more positive, especially, the biggest The only negative drawback is, oh, well, people will be toxic on voice comms. Yeah, but Valorant has voice comms, and Riot manages to, to moderate that. Now, I don't play a lot of Valorant. I don't claim to know whether it's moderated perfectly well or not. But, and you do run into, some, I think it's funny, but you run into some rather untasteful language in CSGO every now and again and whatnot. That being said, I don't think that the negatives outweigh the positives. I really think being able to connect with your teammates on a human level, being able to talk to them and focus on the same thing and understanding what they're looking at, what they're paying attention to, what they're seeing, what they're not seeing, what you're going for as a team, being able to call off objectives and things like that before they get started, and have an actual conversation about whether you can do those things or not, rather than just like scrambling or having split decisions and things like that. I think it can be really, really good. Sorry, I'm sick. We're going nearly 2 hours, and I'm about at the end of what I can take with my breath here. But that's a really big thing. I mean, for a team game to not have the ability to communicate in voice, I think just feels really bad. And at the very least, they could try it, and it would bring a lot of people back to the game, get them interested in the game again, bring a lot of hype to the game. And then if it doesn't work and people are being really toxic assholes or whatever, then they can just remove it. It is what it is. I think they should add voice comms. That relates to this next point, which is solo queue team game, no ranked fives. So ranked fives we'll put aside for a second, because I don't think that that's like the problem with the solo queue player base. In fact, I don't know that would help the solo queue player base to add another mode. But League is a team game. So to play every game, or for the main mode to just be solo queue, feels like something is wrong a little bit. Realistically, I think what most people want to do when they play League is play with a full team of 5 people. I think everybody would prefer that. It's just difficult to find a team of 5 people to permanently be playing with. So matchmaking is easier, right? Playing these pickup games with the automatic matchmaking for you is easier. However, that doesn't mean you can't make the game more team oriented by doing things like adding voice comms, or by replacing flex queue, as I've said, which is just a complete joke, with team ranked fives again, which is a game mode where you can pre-create a team that has a name and its own rank that is different than all of the players' ranks. So if you belong to that team, you kind of have access to that rank while you're part of the team. So your highest team rank would show up as your team rank. But at the end of the day, the rank belongs to the team, not to an individual player. And so you can have a team together. This is something that used to exist in League, by the way. It was actually the way that qualifiers worked. You had to be top 20 on the ranked fives ladder to qualify for open qualifier tournaments. Now it's just based on the average solo queue rank. You get points assigned to you based on the solo queue rank of your players. So this allowed for a direct path from the client to the LCS. And that doesn't exist anymore. But we are getting closer to going back to that era. For one, obviously, the LTA or whatever is doing terrible. I mean, it was an absolute disaster to combine with a region that doesn't speak the same language. I said this was going to be a problem. To give residency as well to a bunch of more players who aren't from the region. Anyways, that's a whole nother topic for another video, but obviously they completely killed the LCS. But there used to be a path straight from the client into the LCS. We're getting closer than ever before, because what you can do now is, if you have 5 high-ranking solo queue players, you can put a team together, go through the open qualifier tournament, qualify for the Challenger Series, and then in the Challenger Series, you can, win the Challenger Series, and then you have that one guest spot in the LCS for a Challenger Series team, or in the LTA or whatever they want to call it, that you can participate in, that you can potentially get into. So that actually that whole path still exists. But wouldn't it make a whole lot more sense if there was a teams ladder to qualify into that? And I'm not just talking about, because I know this is limited to very upper end players, but I'm not just talking about that, even for your casual players. So that's on the upper end. It would make things a lot cleaner rather than using solo queue ranks, to have an actual qualification ladder for that. But even for lower ranked players, I think a lot of people would really enjoy team fives where you can only, it's not flex, you can only queue up with 5 people. You have all your friends together in one team. You can even have more than 5 people. You can have like 8 people and just queue up with whatever 5 you have on at the time. And you just slowly make progress, not on your solo queue rank, but on your rank together as a group of friends or as a team. That is an extremely compelling game mode that a lot of people really loved, and they knew that people loved it. So when they replaced it, they didn't just get rid of it like a Twisted Tree Line or an ARAM or something like that. They just replaced it with Flex Queue. But what is Flex Queue? Flex Queue just sucks. It's just a worse version of ranked fives. It has no permanent team unity. There's no open qualifier, incentive for the top teams. There's no like leaderboard of top teams. It's just players. The whole ladder is very non-competitive, especially because there's no qualifying through the top of the ladder, whereas Team Fives was way more competitive because of that, both at the top but also for the casual player. And I think it was just a better experience. Now, I guess you could argue that the advantage of Flex compared to ranked Team Fives would be, well, you can queue up for Flex with, with more people, like you can, or with different amounts of people, like you can queue up solo, and things like that. Whereas you can't do that but that's what solo queue is for, right? So queuing up solo is kind of ridiculous. You used to be able to queue up as 4 for Flex, which made sense. Like that's the situation where ranked fives kind of failed, is if you're missing one teammate or something like that, and so you just can't play. That's where Flex seemed a little bit better. But of course, there were so few solo players queuing up solo for Flex that they disabled being able to play with 4 players. The other thing that ranked fives offered was that you were allowed to play with players of any rank in solo queue, because it was about playing together as a team no matter what. And that is something that you cannot do anymore with with Flex. Flex was also advertised as one of the other advantages of Flex, besides being able to queue as 4, was that you'd be able to queue with any player no matter what rank they were, in the same way you would with ranked Team Fives. But they went back on that. And so now if you're, I forget what the exact ranked restrictions are, but like if you get to like Emerald, your ranked teammates have to be like within 2 ranks of you or something like that. If you get to Masters Plus in Flex, I think your teammates have to be at least Emerald. So there's a lot of ranked restrictions that actually I've seen all the time prevent people from playing Flex with each other. And I think that that's ridiculous and sucks, because that wasn't something that existed with Team Fives, or ranked fives. And it was something that they basically promised and assured, don't worry, you'll be able to do this, and then took it away. So Team Fives lets you queue up with any group of players that you want to, right? As long as you're willing to play with each other, right? If you've got a high rated friend who wants to play with you guys, then sure. And your team is going to get to the appropriate rank that it belongs. And it's not going to be a huge deal for, matchmaking quality or whatever. Like teams are just going to have to deal with that. So I really think that they should replace Flex Queue with a more competitive team mode that's available to people all the time. We've talked about this before, but Clash has sort of tried to fulfill this role, but because it's so infrequent, it's not quite the same for multiple reasons, right? It's not a ranked ladder that you can grind on with a team. It's just something that is more of a tournament that happens infrequently. So I think between it not having a rank and a ladder and it being so infrequent, it's just not fulfilling the same role as ranked fives would. And hey, a lot of Clash teams that have gotten together and continuously play Clash would love to do Team Fives on days where there aren't Clash. The main drawback to something like ranked fives or Team Fives is that it would obviously take away from solo queue potentially a little bit, because it's just better. But of course, if you eliminated Flex, the impact would be minimal. And any additional impact beyond eliminating Flex and those Flex players going and playing Team Fives would just be because the game mode's better. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with that, right? I think you eliminate game modes because they're splitting queue times when the game mode's less popular or dead or not popular at all. But I think when a game mode is just the better version of the game to play, and people actually prefer it a lot, it's not a good reason to to steer clear of having that game mode in the game. So I really think that they should do that as well as voice comms. There's all kinds of other things that they could do, but the tutorial we basically briefly mentioned, they really need to rework the tutorial for new players so it actually teaches them the game. There needs to be a tutorial on jungle, things like that. But obviously there's a lot that they could do to fix the game, even that's not mentioned here. But obviously with such big player base declines, they need to do something, and they need to do something swiftly. With that being said, good luck in solo queue and have a wonderful day.